The cafe went dead quiet. 23 people sat with their coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths. Their eyes pointed somewhere else, at their phones, at the window, at absolutely nothing, while three men laughed and kicked the wheels of a woman's wheelchair like it was sport. She wasn't crying. That was the thing nobody expected. She just sat there with her jaw set and her knuckles white on the armrests, staring at a fixed point on the wall, the way a person stares when they've learned that making eye contact only makes it worse. And the whole room let it happen. Every single person in that cafe made the same quiet, cowardly calculation. Not my problem, not my fight, not today. Every person except one. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories that will stop you cold and stay with you long after they're over. Smash the like button if you want more, and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. Now let's get into it. Pine Hollow, Kentucky wasn't the kind of town people wrote songs about. It didn't have a charming main square or a famous diner that showed up in travel magazines. What it had was a single traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 o'clock, a hardware store that had been closing down for 15 years without ever actually closing, and the particular exhausted dignity of a place that had been forgotten by everyone who left and everyone who stayed. Ethan Cross had stayed. He'd had reasons to leave, good ones, the kind that come wrapped in dress uniforms and folded flags, and the particular silence of a house that used to have 2 adults in it. But leaving would have meant uprooting Sophie, and Sophie was 8 years old and had her mother's laugh and a habit of collecting smooth rocks from the creek behind their house. And Ethan had decided somewhere in the dark of a very bad year that the least he could do was keep her roots intact, even if his own had come loose from the ground entirely. The garage helped. Cross Auto, which had a hand-painted sign that Sophie had insisted on helping with, so the letters were slightly uneven, and there was a small yellow sun in the corner that had nothing to do with cars, but everything to do with his daughter. He opened at 7, closed at 6, did honest work for fair prices, and that was enough. Most days it was enough. Most mornings he stopped at Della's Cafe on Birch Street before opening the shop. Not for the coffee, which was adequate at best, but for the routine. After years of military precision, schedules carved into stone, every minute accounted for, civilian life had taught him that small rituals kept a person from drifting. So he sat in the same chair by the second window, ordered the same dark roast, and read whatever news was worth reading on his phone while the town woke up around him. He was doing exactly that on the Tuesday morning that changed everything. He almost didn't notice them at first. The cafe was half full, maybe 20 people scattered across the tables, the low murmur of conversation, the sound of Della herself moving behind the counter with her particular efficient shuffle. And then there was a different sound. A scraping. A laugh with something mean at the bottom of it. Ethan looked up. There was a woman near the entrance in a manual wheelchair, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, dressed like someone who had an early meeting. Blazer, nice slacks, the kind of put together that takes effort. She'd been trying to maneuver through the gap between 2 tables, and now there were 3 men blocking her path. Not accidentally. They were young, late 20s, the expensive casual clothes of people who'd inherited money rather than made it. And one of them had his foot resting against the front wheel of her chair, the way you might rest your foot against a piece of furniture. Sorry, he was saying. Not sorry at all. Didn't see you there. His friends were grinning. She said something Ethan couldn't hear from across the room. Her voice was controlled, practiced. The voice of someone who had learned to keep the temperature out of it, because temperature only gave people like this more to work with. What? The man said, louder now, performing for his audience. I'm just standing here, public place. And then one of the others, deliberately, there was no other word for it, reached down and gave the wheel a sharp sideways push. The chair lurched. Her coffee, which she'd been balancing on her lap, went sideways. The cup didn't fall, but the lid came loose and coffee sloshed across her slacks. And the men laughed. And the cafe stayed very, very quiet. 23 people looked away. Ethan put down his phone. He wasn't angry. That was the thing he'd noticed about himself over the years, the way combat had rewired his threat response. He didn't get hot anymore. He got cold and clear, like something settling into focus. He stood up from his chair, which scraped back against the floor and made a sound that cut through the cafe noise, and he walked across the room. He wasn't large in the way that made people nervous from a distance. He was 6'1", built lean and permanent, with the kind of stillness in his movement that you only get from years of learning to control exactly how much space you take up. He stopped beside the man with his foot on the wheel and looked at him. Just looked. "Move your foot," Ethan said. The man blinked. He hadn't expected to be addressed. None of them had. "Excuse me?" "Your foot," Ethan said. "Move it." There was a beat. The kind of beat where a person decides what kind of person they are in this particular moment. The man looked Ethan over, doing the calculation. And something in what he found there made the calculation come out differently than he'd probably intended. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the fact that Ethan wasn't leaning in, wasn't puffing up, was just standing there with his hands loose at his sides, like a man who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing in particular to prove. "We're just having a conversation," the man said, still performing, but quieter now. "No," Ethan said. "You're not." The friend who'd pushed the chair took a half step forward. Ethan moved his gaze to him, nothing more, and the half step stopped. "This is none of your business," the first man said. "You made it everyone's business when you did it in public." Ethan turned to the woman. "You okay?" She looked at him. Something complicated moved through her expression. Not relief exactly, not gratitude, something harder than either of those things. Like she wasn't sure what to do with what was happening. "Fine," she said. He nodded. He looked back at the three men. "She's trying to get through. You're in the way. That's going to change." The silence in the cafe had gone from uncomfortable to something else. Attentive. 23 people who'd been looking away were now looking directly at this. And the men knew it, and the dynamic had shifted in the particular way it shifts when the math stops working in your favor. The man with his foot on the wheel took his foot off the wheel. They moved. Not gracefully. There was some muttering, some performance of not being bothered. But they moved. Cleared a path. The woman rolled forward through the gap, and Ethan stepped back to let her pass. And that was it. No punches. No shouting. Just three men who'd discovered that the room wasn't actually on their side, and one man who'd been the first to make that clear. He went back to his table. Della was looking at him from behind the counter with an expression he didn't quite know how to read. Around the cafe, the low murmur of conversation resumed, slowly, the way sound returns after something unexpected. Ethan picked up his phone and looked at it without actually reading anything. A minute passed. 2. That was interesting. He looked up. The woman had maneuvered her chair to the edge of his table. Up close she was younger than he'd first thought, though she had the eyes of someone who'd been through something that had aged her in ways a birthday couldn't measure. There was a coffee stain across the right leg of her slacks that she was very carefully not looking at. "Sorry about your pants," he said. "They'll wash." She had a directness about her that he appreciated. No wasted words, no softening of edges. "I'm Ava." "Ethan." "Were you actually going to do something if they didn't back down?" He considered the question seriously, which seemed to surprise her. "I was going to figure it out," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then something almost like a smile crossed her face. Not quite, but almost. Honest answer. She didn't sit down and join him. She didn't ask for his number or offer some grateful speech about what he'd done. She just nodded. The nod of one person acknowledging another person as a person, and wheeled herself to the counter to replace her coffee. And when she left the cafe 10 minutes later, she didn't look back. He noticed the wheel, though. As she was maneuvering toward the door, he heard the sound. A grinding, irregular wobble that shouldn't have been there. The push from earlier, or maybe something older, but either way, the front left wheel was compromised, and he knew that sound the way a doctor knows a symptom. He caught her at the door. "Your front wheel," he said. She stopped, looked down. "It needs to be looked at," he said. Not urgently, but soon. The bearing's going." "How do you know that?" "I own a garage. Cross Auto on Mallard. Bring it by whenever. I'll take a look." He held the door for her. "No charge." She studied him. The expression was the same one from before. That complicated thing, like she was running some internal calculation that kept coming out with an unexpected result. Why? It was a fair question. He thought about it. "Because someone pushed it," he said, "and that's not right." He thought about her a little on the drive to the shop. Not the way a person thinks about an attractive stranger, though she was, unquestionably, someone you looked at, But the way you think about a thing that doesn't quite add up. There was something about her that didn't fit Pine Hollow, some quality of controlled intensity that belonged in a bigger city, in rooms with conference tables and actual decisions being made. And she'd said she was fine before he'd even asked if she was fine, which meant she was practiced at saying it. He let it go. He had a carburetor to rebuild before 9 o'clock. Sophie was already at school, dropped off on the way, and she'd made him promise to bring home milk and the good kind of crackers, not the wheat ones, which had been a whole negotiation at 7 in the morning. He kept a running list on his phone of things he needed to remember because he'd learned that his memory, excellent for mechanical problems and tactical assessments, had a significant gap when it came to grocery items and permission slips. Roy was already at the shop when Ethan pulled up. Roy Daniels, 61 years old, 30 years of doing this work before his knees had started making their opinions known, and the best diagnostic ear Ethan had ever encountered. He could hear an engine running wrong from a parking lot. He was also deeply nosy and had no awareness of this. "You're 3 minutes late," Roy said, without looking up from the engine he was reading the way some people read books. "I had a thing at Della's." "What kind of thing?" Ethan told him, briefly. Roy straightened up slowly, joints conducting their usual protest. "The Sterling girl," Roy said. Ethan looked at him. "You know her?" "Grew up here, before." Her family had money, not Hawthorne money, but real money. He wiped his hands on a rag with the focused attention of a man who is choosing his next words carefully. "She left after the accident, 7 years back." "What accident?" Roy looked at him. Something in his expression went deliberate. "She was in a car crash, real bad one. They said it was her fault. Most people who knew her didn't believe that." He paused. "The Hawthorns were involved, one way or another. That's all anyone ever said publicly." "And privately?" Roy turned back to the engine. "Privately, people said a lot of things and then stopped saying them." Ethan let that sit for a moment. Then he went to get changed into his work clothes, and the day got busy, and he mostly stopped thinking about Ava Sterling. She came by the next morning. He heard the chair on the concrete apron before he saw her, and when he came out from under the truck he was working on, she was in the doorway of the garage with the particular expression of a person who has made a decision they're not entirely comfortable with. "You said bring it by," she said. "I did." He stood up, wiped his hands. "Come in. I'll get a look at it." He crouched beside the chair while she sat in it, which felt awkward for about 30 seconds, and then didn't, because the problem was clearly mechanical, and once he was looking at a mechanical problem, he tended to stop thinking about the human dimensions of the situation. The bearing in the front left wheel was worse than he'd thought. The push from the cafe had accelerated damage that had probably been accumulating for months. Small compromises in the housing, debris in the race, the beginning of the kind of failure that happens suddenly and at the worst possible moment. "Has this been grinding for a while?" he asked. "Maybe a couple weeks?" "You should have gotten it looked at." "I know." He glanced up at her. She was watching him work with the same directness she'd brought to everything, like she didn't see the point in pretending she wasn't watching. "I can fix it today," he said, "but I'll need you to transfer out while I do it. I've got a chair." "I can manage." He nodded. Got the shop chair, an ordinary folding chair that he propped against the workbench, and stepped back while she transferred herself from the wheelchair to it with the precise, economical movement of someone who had done this 10,000 times. No help offered, none needed. He worked. She sat. Roy appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation with the subtlety of a man who has none, and then made himself busy on the other side of the garage while very clearly continuing to track everything happening. "You didn't grow up here," Ava said after a while. "No, Virginia originally. Came here about 5 years ago." "Why here?" "My wife was from here. After she died, it seemed—" He paused, fitting a new bearing into the housing. "It seemed like the right place for Sophie to be. Near her grandmother, familiar places. Roots." "Sophie's your daughter." "Yeah." A pause. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. Not in the reflexive way people said it, but in the way of a person who actually meant the words and understood their weight. "Thank you," he said. He could feel her looking at him, that direct, steady attention. "Roy told me you were military," she said. He glanced over at Roy, who was absolutely not looking at them. "Navy," Ethan said. "Long?" 12 years. She didn't ask why he'd left. He didn't explain. Some things don't need the full architecture of their reasons laid out for people you've only just met, and she seemed to understand that. You fixed it, she said when he rolled the chair back to her. New bearing, cleaned the race, adjusted the caster. He set it beside her. It'll run smooth now. Come back if anything feels off. She transferred back with the same efficiency, tested the wheel with a push of her hand. The chair rolled clean and quiet. What do I owe you? She asked. Nothing. She looked at him. I told you, he said. No charge. There was a long pause. Something in her expression shifted. Not the almost smile from the cafe, something less guarded than that, and more complicated. You know, she said, most people in this town can't look at me directly. He looked at her directly. I know, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded, that same acknowledging nod from the cafe, and wheeled herself toward the door. I'll see you around, Ethan Cross, she said. He went back to his truck. Roy appeared at his elbow with the speed of a man who'd been waiting. Well, Roy said. Don't, Ethan said. Roy didn't say anything, but he was smiling, and he kept smiling for most of the rest of the morning, and that was somehow worse. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, tucked in with her collection of smooth creek stones arranged by size on her windowsill, Ethan stood in his kitchen with a glass of water and thought about what Roy had said. The Hawthorns were involved. That's all anyone ever said publicly. He'd been in Pine Hollow 5 years. He'd heard the Hawthorne name the way you heard weather, frequently, and as a background fact of life. They owned property downtown, had fingers in county government, showed up at events with the comfortable ease of people who had decided a long time ago that showing up was enough because everyone understood the dynamic. Martin Hawthorne, the patriarch, was 70-something and moved through town like a man who'd never once had to question whether his presence was welcome. His son, Davis Hawthorne, was 35 and was exactly the kind of man his father's money had produced. Not stupid, but careless in the specific way of people who have never once been truly accountable for anything. Ethan had fixed Davis Hawthorne's car twice, said hello across parking lots, the way you did in a small town. He thought about a woman sitting with her jaw set and her knuckles white while 3 men laughed at her, and a whole cafe that looked away. He thought about a bearing that had been grinding for weeks before anyone offered to fix it. He rinsed his glass. Went to bed. Told himself it wasn't his concern. But the thing about stillness, real stillness, the kind trained into a person rather than found naturally, is that underneath it, something is almost always working. And Ethan Cross, lying in the quiet of his house in Pine Hollow, Kentucky, had already started paying attention. He just didn't know yet what he was paying attention to. The friendship, if you could call it that yet, built the way most real things build. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, ordinary ones. Ava came back to the garage 3 days after he fixed her wheel. Not because anything was wrong with the chair. She showed up at 9:15 with 2 coffees from Della's and a carrier balanced on her lap, navigated the concrete apron with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago stopped apologizing for the space she took up, and set one of the cups on Ethan's workbench without preamble. Repayment, she said. He looked at the coffee. He'd told her no charge. You didn't have to. I know. She was already looking at the truck he was working on. What's wrong with it? Transmission. The owner thinks it's the engine. Is the owner wrong? Enthusiastically. She made a sound that was close to a laugh. She stayed for 40 minutes, which surprised him, and talked about cars with a fluency that surprised him more. She'd grown up watching her father work on a vintage Mustang, she told him, the way some kids watch their parents cook or garden, not because they had to, but because the person they loved was doing it, and proximity to that person had been worth whatever boredom the activity brought. She'd never finished the Mustang. Her father had died before they got to the carburetor. It's still in the garage at the house, she said. I haven't decided what to do with it. Your house on Harrison Street. She looked at him sideways. News travels. Small town. It's my mother's house, technically. She moved to Lexington 2 years ago. Couldn't manage the stairs anymore. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I've been renting it from her, fixing it up slowly. It's adapted now. The downstairs, mostly. It works. He nodded. He could hear something underneath the practical details. Not quite ownership, not quite grief, something in between. The way a place becomes more than a building when it's the only piece of a life that stayed put. She left when the phone rang and didn't come back that day, but she came back the following week, and the week after that. Not every day. She had a life that existed well beyond Pine Hollow, a company in Louisville with actual employees and quarterly reports, and a board that had opinions about everything she did. But when she was in town, she had a way of drifting toward Birch Street, and sometimes toward the garage on Mallard, and Ethan found that he didn't mind. Sophie met her on a Saturday afternoon in early October. Ethan had been expecting some degree of awkwardness. Sophie was 8 and had her mother's social instincts, which meant she either attached to a person immediately or observed them with the unnerving patience of someone conducting a silent assessment. With Ava, she did both simultaneously. She walked out of the garage where she'd been doing homework at the folding table he kept for exactly that purpose, stopped 3 feet away from Ava's chair, and stared at it with the open curiosity that children carry before the world teaches them that staring is impolite. "Does it go fast?" Sophie asked. Ava looked at her. "Fast enough." "Faster than running?" "Depends on who's running." Sophie considered this seriously. "I'm pretty fast." "You look it," Ava said. Sophie thought about that for a moment, decided it was a compliment, and moved on to the next thing with the conversational efficiency of someone who had a lot of questions and limited patience for preamble. She asked about the hand rims, the brakes, whether Ava ever raced anyone, whether racing someone in a wheelchair was cheating. Ethan watched from the doorway of the garage with his arms crossed and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Sophie was doing what Sophie always did, reducing any situation to its actual human components with a directness that he'd long ago stopped trying to moderate. Ava answered every question straight, no talking to a child's softness, no deflection, just answered, which was apparently the right move, because after 15 minutes, Sophie asked if she wanted to come see the creek behind their house. And Ava said maybe next time, and Sophie said okay with the particular satisfaction of having extracted a commitment. Later, when Ava had gone and Sophie was back at her homework, Ethan sat at the workbench and realized that something had shifted in the weight of his day, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Roy was the one who told him about the letters. It was a Thursday morning, second week of October, and Roy came in 20 minutes late with the particular energy of someone who has been talking to people and has things to report. He poured his coffee, drank half of it standing at the counter, and then turned around with the air of a man who has decided there is no graceful way to get into what he wants to say. "The Hawthorns are buying Harrison Street," he said. Ethan looked up from the invoice he was working on. "All of it?" "Near enough. They've got 11 of the 14 properties already. Commercial complex, retail, office space, a parking structure. Big." Roy set his cup down. "The Harrison Street project's been in the county planning office for 8 months. Most people didn't know about it because it wasn't advertised like it should have been. Word got out last week." Ethan thought about what he'd seen driving down Harrison Street. Old houses, most of them, the kind that had been there long enough to have grown into the landscape, with trees the size of a person's history. Ava's house, her mother's house, on the corner. "Her house," he said. Roy nodded. "It's the last piece they need. Without that corner lot, the ingress for the parking structure doesn't work. The whole project depends on it." "Does she know?" "She got a letter 2 weeks ago. Offered a purchase. Very formal, very generous on paper." Roy paused. "From what I hear, the letter also came with the opinion that it would be in her interest to accept quickly, because the county zoning variance goes to review next month, and once it's approved, the mechanisms of progress tend to be difficult to stop." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "That's not an offer," he said. "That's a timeline." "No," Roy said, "it's not." He called her that evening. He didn't stop to think about whether calling was appropriate or whether it crossed some line in the very new and undefined geography of whatever they were to each other. He just called, standing on his back porch while the October dark came in across the yard. She picked up on the third ring. "Roy told me," he said. A pause. "Your Roy is a very effective information network." "He is. Ava, I'm not selling," she said. Flat and certain, no room in the sentence for discussion. "I want to be clear about that up front before you say whatever you're going to say. I wasn't going to tell you to sell." Another pause, different from the first. "Okay," she said. "I was going to ask if you were all right." The silence that followed had a texture to it. He could hear her breathing, just barely, and something that might have been the creak of her house settling around her. "I'm angry," she said finally. "Is that all right?" "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." She told him the rest of it then. Not all at once, not neatly, but in the way that things come out when you've been holding them alone too long and someone has asked the right question. The letter had come on a Monday. By Thursday, a county inspector she'd never seen before had shown up at the house citing concerns about the ramp installation at the side entrance, concerns that had never been raised in 2 years of the ramp existing. She'd called a contractor who told her the installation was fine. She'd called the county and been told the inspection was routine. She'd filed a rebuttal. Nothing had happened with it. "They're testing," she said, "seeing if I'll just get tired." "Will you?" "No." "Then quieter." But it's exhausting, knowing that's what they're doing. He understood that kind of exhaustion. It wasn't the exhaustion of work. He'd done work that broke down the body and was fine with it. It was the exhaustion of being fought with methods designed to make you feel like you were imagining it, like the problem was your perception, not their behavior. "Don't respond to anything alone," he said. "Get a lawyer to look at that letter before the week is out." "I have a lawyer. I have several lawyers. I run a company, Ethan." "Right." He felt slightly foolish. "Sorry." "Don't apologize. She stopped. "It's actually nice that you said it. That someone just said it." He stayed on the phone longer than he'd planned. She asked about Sophie, which surprised him, and he found himself talking about the morning. Sophie's insistence on a specific brand of orange juice, the rock she'd brought home from school that she claimed was a fossil, which it wasn't, but which she had placed on her windowsill with the same reverence as the others. Ava listened with what felt like genuine attention, not politely, actually listening. When they hung up, he stood on the porch for a while longer in the dark, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. A dog somewhere, wind in the oaks behind the fence, the distant punctuation of a car on the highway, and thought about Roy's words. The Hawthorns were involved. People said things and then stopped saying them. The false violations started on a Monday. Ethan arrived at the garage at his usual time to find a notice from the county building department taped to the door. Alleged code violations, improper storage of hazardous materials, inadequate ventilation certification, concerns about drainage. The notice had been generated on Friday and posted over the weekend, which was not normal procedure. The violations cited were either flat wrong or technically arguable, in the way that code language is always arguable, crafted, in other words, to create work and expense and uncertainty rather than to address any actual problem. He stood there with the paper in his hand for a long minute. Roy showed up behind him, read it over his shoulder, and said something emphatic that Ethan chose not to repeat in his mental record of the morning. "When did you last have your certification renewed?" Ethan asked. "6 months ago. Everything was clean." "I know." Ethan folded the notice and put it in his back pocket. "I know it was." He made appointments, called the county office, where the person on the phone was polite and unhelpful in equal measure. Called his own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Geary in Bardstown, who had handled his business filing and the property deed and was the kind of methodical that he found reassuring. She told him to document everything, respond to nothing in writing without her review, and to consider the possibility that this was harassment rather than legitimate regulatory action. "I'm already considering it," he said. He told Ava when he saw her that Thursday. She'd come by the garage, not with coffee this time, just herself, and was sitting in the doorway watching the street while he worked on a brake job, and he gave her the short version without editorializing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ethan, I'm sorry. It's not your fault." "That's not what I said." He looked at her. She held his gaze with the directness he'd come to expect, but there was something in it now that he hadn't seen before, guilt, or something close to it. The particular guilt of knowing that your situation has damaged someone else's. "You didn't do anything," he said. "They did. Because you helped me." "They were going to come for me eventually anyway," he said, which was probably not true but felt like the right thing to say. He saw her read that on his face and almost correct him, and then decide not to. "We should talk," she said, "about more than just the violations." "Okay." "Not here." She glanced at Roy, who was absolutely working on something in the back with great concentration. "Somewhere quiet." They went to her house that evening after he dropped Sophie at his neighbor Linda's place, which Sophie treated as a social engagement and packed a small bag for as though she were visiting another country. Ava's house on Harrison Street was a 1940s two-story that had been opened up on the ground floor. Walls moved, doorways widened, everything practical and unobtrusive, the adaptations woven into the space without announcing themselves. It didn't look like a house that had been retrofitted. It looked like a house that had been thought about. The living room had books stacked on a low table, a throw that had been used rather than displayed, shoes beside the door. It looked like someone actually lived there, which shouldn't have been notable, but somehow was. He'd been in houses that felt like they were waiting for a photograph to be taken. This wasn't that. She made tea, which he didn't particularly want, but accepted because the act of making it seemed to give her hands something to do. And they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the particular formality of two people about to have a real conversation. 7 years ago, she said, I was in a car accident. He said nothing. Let her take the shape she needed. It was a Saturday night, January. I was coming back from Louisville on Route 47. She held her mug with both hands, the same way she'd held the coffee cup at the garage, and looked at a point somewhere between the table and the door. A car crossed the center line and hit me head on. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks. The damage to my spine was... She stopped, started again. It was permanent. They were very clear about that. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it the way she'd meant it when she'd said it to him about his wife, not as a social filler, but as something real. The driver of the other car was Davis Hawthorne, she said. The name landed in the room and stayed there. He was 22. He'd been at a dinner party at his father's house in Findlay County. That's 30 miles east past the highway. He was drunk. Witnesses at the party said later that he'd had a lot to drink, that multiple people had offered to drive him, that he'd refused. She set her mug down. That's not what the official accident report said. What did the official report say? That road conditions were a factor, that his blood alcohol was within legal limits. She paused. His blood was drawn 2.5 hours after the accident, at a hospital 40 minutes from the scene, after a delay that was never formally explained. Ethan thought about that. The way evidence behaves when someone with resources and motivation is managing the situation. There was a witness, Ava said. A man who'd been driving behind Davis Hawthorne for nearly 8 miles, had seen him swerving, had seen him cross the line just before he hit me. That man's name appeared in the initial responding officer's notes. She looked at him directly. He does not appear anywhere in the official investigation. His name was removed. He was never contacted by investigators. He doesn't exist in the case record. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing through the oaks along Harrison Street with the particular sound of October, dry and purposeful. They came to me 3 months after the accident, she said, while I was still doing rehab. Martin Hawthorne's attorneys. They had a settlement agreement, a significant amount of money, and a confidentiality clause that covered the cause of the accident, the investigation, Davis's involvement, all of it. They told me I could fight it, but that the investigation had found no negligence, that I would face years of litigation against a family with essentially unlimited legal resources, and that I would probably lose. She stopped. They told me that what mattered now was my future, that I should take the money and focus on my recovery. And you signed. I was 23 years old, she said quietly. I'd just been told I would never walk again. I'd lost my job, my apartment, everything I'd been building, and I was very, very tired. She looked at her hands. So yes, I signed. He didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say to that, and he'd learned that trying to find useful things to say in the face of someone else's real pain was usually more about the person speaking than the person listening. I came back here because of the house, she said. My company has an office in Louisville. I can work from anywhere. And honestly, I came back because I wanted something that was mine again, something they hadn't taken. She looked around the kitchen with a complicated expression. I didn't think it would matter to them. It's been 7 years. Davis is 30 now. Martin is old. She paused. I forgot that powerful people don't let the past stay past when it becomes inconvenient. The property deal, Ethan said. If I sell and go quietly, the past stays buried and they get their corner lot. If I fight, if I'm visible, if people look at me and start asking questions, there's a risk that someone remembers. That the wrong person starts pulling at the wrong thread. She met his eyes. I think that's why the harassment has already started. They don't want me entrenched. They want me gone before I become a problem. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze the way she always did, that level directness. But underneath it, for the first time, he could see what it cost her. The 7 years of carrying this alone. The specific exhaustion of being the person who knows the truth and has no clean way to use it. You said you came back because you wanted something that was yours again, he said. Yes. Then keep it, he said. She looked at him as though she were checking whether he understood what he was saying, what that might mean, what it might ask of both of them. It's not going to be simple, she said. I know. They have a lot of resources. I know that too. A long pause. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks again. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. Why? She said. The same question she'd asked at the garage, but with more weight behind it now. More at stake. He thought about Sophie. About a small girl with smooth creek rocks lined up on her windowsill, watching her father move through a life that had contracted significantly since her mother died. About the particular thing that goes quiet in a person when they stop fighting for anything beyond getting through the day. Because someone has to, he said, and then, more honestly, and because I'm tired of watching from the sidelines. She didn't say anything to that. But she didn't look away either, and after a moment she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, just a second, nothing more than contact, and then she picked up her mug again, and the conversation moved forward. He drove home through the dark streets of Pine Hollow with the heater running and the radio off, thinking about a police report with a missing name and a family that had spent 7 years believing the silence would hold, and a woman who had signed a piece of paper in a hospital room at 23 years old and had been paying for it ever since. He thought about what Roy had said, weeks ago now. People said things and then stopped saying them. He thought about the way Ava had looked when she'd said the word tired. Not broken, she was the least broken person he'd met in a long time, but carrying something that had been heavy for so long she'd probably forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. He turned onto his street, pulled into the drive, sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. He'd spent 12 years as a SEAL, learning that the most dangerous thing a person could do was mistake patience for weakness. The Hawthorns had been patient. They'd waited 7 years, waited until they had a reason, waited until the property deal gave them cover for pushing her out. That patience had probably felt to them like strength. He got out of the car, went inside, checked on Sophie's room. She was home now, already asleep, one hand curled under her cheek and the creek rocks standing their orderly watch on the windowsill. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. He'd been patient too. 5 years of small routines and honest work, and not asking too much of a life that had already taken something irreplaceable from him. But there was a difference between patience and standing still. And somewhere between a cafe on a Tuesday morning and a kitchen table on an October night, he had started to remember it. The name Ethan needed came from an unlikely place. It was Roy, again. Roy, with his 30 years of accumulated local knowledge and his complete inability to mind his own business, which Ethan had long since stopped viewing as a character flaw and started viewing as an operational asset. 3 days after Ethan's conversation with Ava, Roy came in with his coffee and his news-bearing energy, and this time what he had wasn't gossip. It was a name. Tom Haskell, Roy said. He was the responding deputy the night of Ava's accident, first one on scene. Ethan looked up. Was? Retired. 3 years ago. He's got a place out on Cutter Road, keeps chickens, bothers nobody. Roy paused. Word is he didn't retire as happy as a man who's done his job well and is ready for rest. Word is he's been carrying something. Who told you that? His sister goes to the same hair salon as Linda Marsh. Ethan sat with the particular absurdity of small-town intelligence networks for a moment, then moved past it. You think he'll talk? I think he's been waiting for someone to ask the right way. Ethan drove out to Cutter Road on a Saturday morning, leaving Sophie with Roy for 2 hours. An arrangement Sophie treated as a vacation, and Roy treated with the seriousness of a man who had been entrusted with something precious and breakable. The address was a property set back from the road behind a stand of cedars, the house modest and well kept in the way of people who had stopped caring what others thought, but hadn't stopped caring about the work itself. There were chickens, as advertised. Also a vegetable garden that was being put to bed for winter, covered in straw. Tom Haskell was 63, heavy through the shoulders, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent decades outdoors and hadn't bothered fighting it. He was splitting wood beside the barn when Ethan pulled up, and he watched Ethan get out of the truck with the measured assessment of someone who had spent years reading arriving strangers and making quick determinations. "Mr. Haskell," Ethan said. "Don't know you," Haskell said. Not hostile, factual. "Ethan Cross. I own the garage on Mallard Street in town." He stopped at a respectful distance. "I'm here about an accident on Route 47, January 7 years ago." Haskell set his axe down. The look on his face was not surprise. It was the look of a man who had been expecting a specific knock on the door for a long time and had finally heard it. "Come inside," he said. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke. Haskell poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table, and they sat across from each other the way men sit when they've agreed, without saying it, that they're going to speak plainly. "I was the first car on scene that night," Haskell said. "January 14th, about 11:40 p.m. He held his cup in both hands, staring at a point above Ethan's shoulder. "It was bad. Real bad. The girl, Miss Sterling, was unconscious. The other driver was standing outside his vehicle, which told me he was mobile, so I prioritized her, called for medical, called for backup, stayed with her until the ambulance came." "What about blood alcohol?" Ethan asked. Haskell's jaw tightened. "That's where it gets complicated." He set his cup down carefully, like he was choosing his words the same way. "I smelled alcohol on the other driver, strong. I noted it in my initial field report, the report I filled out at the scene, on paper, because the digital system was down that night, which happens more than people think out there. I noted my observation, the smell, his presentation, his speech, all of it. I requested a field sobriety assessment. And my supervisor showed it up before it was completed." Haskell's voice stayed even, but his hands tightened slightly. "Detective Lieutenant Carver. He didn't usually respond to accident scenes. That's not how it worked. But he was there within 20 minutes, which meant he was already on his way before I'd filed anything official." He paused. "He took over. Told me I was needed back on patrol, that he'd handle it from here. I said I hadn't completed my assessment. He said he'd handle it." "Your field report," Ethan said. "The paper one." "Disappeared." Haskell said it flatly, with the flatness of someone who had said it internally 10,000 times and worn the emotion off the words. "When the investigation file was compiled, the initial report had been replaced by a typed summary that didn't include my observations about the driver's condition. My name was on the new report, but the content wasn't mine." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, a chicken made its opinions known about something. "Did you say anything?" Ethan asked. "I went to Carver. He told me my memory of the night was probably off, that field conditions affect perception, that the typed report reflected the full picture." Haskell looked at him directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "I was 38 days from my pension qualifying date." Ethan didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. "I've thought about that 38 days every day since," Haskell said quietly. "Whether it makes me a coward or just a man." He paused. "I still don't know the answer." "There was a witness," Ethan said. "Someone who'd been driving behind the Hawthorne vehicle." Haskell nodded slowly. "I spoke to him at the scene. Name was Gerald Pruitt. He'd been behind the vehicle for 6-7 miles, said the driving had been erratic the whole time. He saw the car cross the line. He was clear. He was specific. He was sober." Haskell stopped. "I put his name and number in my field notes." "The notes that disappeared?" "Yes." Ethan thought about Ava at 23 years old, in a hospital, signing a document she didn't have the strength to fight. He thought about a paper report that got replaced by a typed one 38 days before a man's pension vested. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" he asked. "To the right people?" Haskell looked at him for a long moment. "What right people?" "Carver's still on the force. He made lieutenant 2 years after the accident." "Not Carver," Ethan said. "Someone else." He'd been thinking about this carefully over the past week, and what he'd concluded was that the problem with the existing structure in Pine Hollow, in Bevel County more broadly, wasn't that every person in it was corrupt. It was that the corrupt ones occupied the specific positions that controlled information flow, which meant that going through normal channels was the same as handing your evidence to the people who wanted it buried. You had to find the honest people who existed outside those channels, or above them. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was not a Hawthorne man. Ethan had worked that out methodically over several weeks, from how he operated, what he said publicly about the rezoning, the fact that he'd been in a visible dispute with county leadership over the budget for the past year. He was 61, 2 years from retirement, and from what Ethan could see, he was the kind of man who'd rather finish his career with his reputation intact than protect someone else's secrets. He met with Pruitt on a Tuesday afternoon at the sheriff's home rather than the office, which had been the sheriff's suggestion when Ethan had made the call. That alone told him something. Pruitt listened. He was a still listener. Didn't interject, didn't show his reactions while Ethan was talking, just took it in. Ethan laid out what he had: Haskell's account, the discrepancy in the accident report, Gerald Pruitt, the missing witness, the pattern of harassment against Ava and now against his own business, the timeline connecting the Hawthorne property deal to the escalation in pressure. When Ethan finished, Pruitt sat quietly for almost a full minute. "Carver," he said finally. He was the point of contact on the night, from what Haskell says. "Carver's connected to Martin Hawthorne through the County Development Committee. Has been for years." Pruitt said it with the exhausted matter-of-factness of someone who has known something uncomfortable for a long time and had nowhere clean to put it. "I've never had cause to move on it. A connection isn't evidence." "Haskell's testimony is," Ethan said. Pruitt looked at him steadily. "Haskell's testimony puts him in a difficult position." He stayed quiet. "He was 38 days from his pension. I understand that, and I'm not saying it makes him a bad man, but a defense attorney will make hay out of it." "Which is why you need Gerald Pruitt," Ethan said. "The witness. His account exists independent of anything Haskell did or didn't do." Pruitt leaned back. "If he's still findable." "I'm working on that." Another pause. Pruitt rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man doing a private calculation about what the next move costs him personally. "If I open an inquiry," he said slowly, "it goes over Carver's head directly to the State Investigative Division. That's a significant step. It makes enemies." "You're 2 years from retirement," Ethan said. Pruitt looked at him sharply. Then something in his expression settled. "Yeah," he said. "I am." He stood up, extended his hand. "I'll need Haskell to make a formal recorded statement, and anything else you find, anything, comes to me directly, not through the department, directly." "Understood," Ethan said. They shook hands. Finding Gerald Pruitt took 11 days in most of Roy's extended social network. The man had moved twice in 7 years, first to Elizabethtown, then to a town in Tennessee called Cookeville, where he worked for a regional trucking company and had been living quietly. He was 54, divorced, and when Ethan finally reached him by phone on a Wednesday evening, the first thing Pruitt said after Ethan explained who he was and why he was calling was, "I wondered if anyone would ever ask." Ethan drove to Cookeville on a Thursday, alone, leaving the garage in Roy's capable hands and Sophie at school with Linda on standby pickup duty. The drive was 3 hours, mostly highway, and he spent it thinking about what he had assembled and what it still needed. Pruitt was a large man with a quiet manner and the slightly deflated look of someone who had done something he wasn't proud of and had been living in its company for years. He met Ethan at a diner near his apartment, ordered coffee, and didn't touch it, and told his story with the precise detail of someone who had rehearsed it internally many times. He'd been driving south on Route 47 behind a black vehicle, later identified as a Hawthorne family SUV, for approximately 7 miles before the accident. The driving had been erratic from the first time he'd seen the vehicle, weaving within the lane, twice drifting across the center line before correcting. He'd slowed deliberately to increase his following distance because he'd recognized the behavior and wanted space. "I saw it happen," Pruitt said. "The car just went. Full across the line. No correction, no brakes, just went." He stared at his untouched coffee. "I was the first one out of my vehicle. The girl was in real bad shape. The other driver was standing by his door, on the phone." "On the phone," Ethan said. "Right away, before I even got to her. He was on the phone." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Someone came and talked to me at the scene. A deputy, young guy, took my name and number, said I'd be contacted. I waited for months. Nobody ever called. Would you be willing to give a formal statement? Ethan asked. To the State Investigative Division. It would mean going on record. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Will it help her? Yes. Then, yeah, he said. I'll do it. He paused. I should have done something 7 years ago. I didn't know how. I didn't know who to call. He looked at his hands. That's not a great excuse. It's a human one, Ethan said. He drove back to Pine Hollow in the dark, got home at 10:30, and sat in his car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The pieces were in place. Haskell, Pruitt, the documentary discrepancy in the accident file, the trail from Carver to the Hawthorns. It wasn't a complete legal case yet. That was for lawyers and investigators. But it was enough to start one that couldn't be quietly managed. He should have felt something like satisfaction. Instead, he felt the weight of what came next. The journalist's name was Claire Ashworth, and she worked for the Lexington Courier, which was a real newspaper with actual resources, which was why Ava had reached out to her rather than the local Pine Hollow Weekly, which was not. Ethan met her for the first time in Ava's kitchen on a Friday evening in mid-November. She was 42, small and unhurried looking, with the kind of attention that made you want to choose your words carefully. Not because she was intimidating, but because she was clearly going to remember everything you said. She had a notebook rather than a recorder, which she explained by saying she found that recorders made people perform. I've been looking into the Hawthorne family's county connections for 8 months, she told them both, seated at the kitchen table with her coffee. Before I knew about Ava's case, the Harrison Street Project has the fingerprints of at least 2 county commissioners who should have recused themselves from the variance review because of documented ties to Hawthorne development interests. She looked at Ava. Your situation it's not separate from that. It's the same story. Ava had been listening with her hands flat on the table, very still in the particular way she went still when she was processing something that mattered. How long before you can publish? Depends on what I have. What you've described to me tonight, the accident, the witness, Haskell's account, that needs to be verified through the investigative process first. I can't publish allegations ahead of a formal investigation without sourcing I can stand behind. She looked at Ethan. But the county corruption angle, the commissioners, the development ties, the procedural irregularities in the variance review, I can move on that faster. And once that's in print, it changes the public context for everything else. They'll know someone is pulling the thread, Ethan said. Yes, Claire said. They will. Ava looked at him. He looked back at her. Good, Ava said. What happened over the next 3 weeks was that the Hawthorns, apparently sensing that something had shifted, the way animals sense weather before the sky changes, accelerated everything. The false violations against the garage came in a second wave, more specific this time, more clearly designed to trigger mandatory closure proceedings if not addressed quickly. Patricia Geary, Ethan's lawyer, fired back responses within 48 hours of each notice and documented everything in language that made clear she was building a record for litigation. The notices slowed, then stopped, but the pause didn't feel like retreat. It felt like reorganization. Ava's house was vandalized on a Thursday night, the accessibility ramp at the side entrance damaged in a way that looked like weather damage if you didn't look closely and was clearly deliberate if you did. The wooden support brackets on one side had been partially sawn through. If she'd used the ramp at speed, which was the only practical way to use it, it would have given way. She'd found it in the morning before she'd used it, noticed the slight list, looked more closely. She called Ethan. He was there in 12 minutes. He looked at the ramp, at the cuts in the wood, clean lines with no splintering, the precise width of a handsaw, and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the November air. This wasn't a message, he said quietly. This was meant to hurt you. Ava looked at the ramp with an expression that had moved past shock into something harder and more certain. I know. You need to tell the sheriff. I already called him. He's sending someone. And you need to stay at... I'm not leaving my house, Ethan. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the absolute composure of someone who has made a decision and closed the door on alternatives, and he recognized it because he'd seen it in the mirror a few times over his own life and knew there was no productive conversation to be had with a person in that state. Okay, he said. Then I'm going to fix the ramp. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He went back to his truck for his toolbox. He was still working on it when the deputy arrived to take Ava's statement, and he finished it as the sun came fully up over Harrison Street, the wood solid again, the brackets replaced with hardware that was heavier than what had been there before. Ava brought him coffee at some point, appeared with it in the doorway, and he drank it crouched beside the repaired support, and neither of them said very much because the morning had already said most of what needed saying. Sophie knew something was happening. Kids always knew, which was one of the things that made parenting both more rewarding and considerably more complicated than Ethan had anticipated. She didn't know the details. He was careful about the details. But she knew her father was worried about something in a way that was different from his usual worries, and she responded by being quieter than usual and by leaving small things on his workbench at the garage. Drawings, a cookie she'd made with Linda, one of her smooth rocks that she placed there without comment. He found the rock on a Wednesday. He put it in his pocket and kept it there. The first of Claire Ashworth's articles ran in the Lexington Courier on a Monday morning in late November. It was above the fold on the county news section and was headlined with the rezoning project, the conflict of interest findings regarding the two commissioners, and a detailed accounting of how the approval process had been managed in ways that bypassed normal public notice requirements. It named Martin Hawthorne's development company as the primary beneficiary. It named the commissioners. It quoted 3 sources and cited public records. Ethan read it at the garage before Roy arrived, on his phone in the early quiet. He read it twice. It was good, methodical and factual and written without the breathlessness that makes people dismiss journalism as agenda, the kind of piece that landed with weight because its architecture was sound. He called Ava. "Have you seen it?" he asked. "I'm looking at it right now." A pause. "She's good." "She is." "My phone has been ringing since 6 this morning. Colleagues, my board chair, people from town I haven't spoken to in years." Another pause. "Also my lawyer, the one who handled the original settlement." Ethan went still. "What did they want?" "She wants to meet. She said she has information she should have shared years ago, and she'd like the opportunity to do that before things progress further." He processed that. A lawyer who had handled the original settlement calling now, wanting to share information. The math of that wasn't complicated. Someone had decided that the cost of continued silence was rising faster than the cost of talking. "Meet with her," he said. "I intend to." He could hear her breathing, the particular rhythm of controlled intensity. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." "Okay. I've been here before. Not exactly here, but in the position where it seems like things are moving in the right direction and then it collapses because they have more resources and more patience than I do." She stopped. "I'm not saying it's going to collapse. I'm saying I'm scared." It was the first time she'd said that to him directly. Not implied it, not let him read it in the careful control of her expression. Said it out loud. "I know," he said. "Does that change anything for you?" "No." A long pause. "Okay," she said. He hung up and sat for a minute in the morning quiet of the garage, looking at the light coming through the high windows and the tools arranged on the pegboard in their particular order, which Sophie had once reorganized by color, which had taken him 3 days to fix, which he'd never told Sophie because the memory of her sitting there carefully arranging wrenches by shade made him smile every time he looked at the board. He thought about the settlement lawyer calling, about the article in print, about Gerald Pruitt in Cookville, ready to give his statement, about Tom Haskell and 38 days and the weight of what a man carries when he takes the path of least resistance and then lives in that decision for years. The Hawthornes had spent 7 years believing that silence was something they'd bought permanently, that if you paid enough, buried enough, pressured enough, the truth eventually became inert, just a thing that had happened with no living consequence. They were about to discover that the truth had been keeping itself ready, that a missing name in a report and a witness who'd moved to Tennessee and a deputy who'd spent 3 years splitting wood on Cutter Road were all still exactly as real as the night they'd been created. Martin Hawthorne was quoted in the next morning's paper as calling the Courier article politically motivated and legally irresponsible. His statement was precise and confident, the statement of a man who had navigated difficult moments before and believed his footing was solid. Ethan read it and thought, "You don't know what's coming." He put the paper down, picked up his coffee, and got to work. The settlement lawyer's name was Margaret Fossey, and she arrived at Ava's house on a Wednesday morning in early December, driving a sensible gray sedan and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived 20 years of difficult meetings. She was 60, silver-haired, with the deliberate posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture communicated something. She had represented Ava during the original settlement negotiation, or represented her in name, which Ava had come to understand were two different things. She sat at the kitchen table where Ethan had sat weeks before, and she put her hands flat on the surface, and she said, "I owe you an apology. I've known that for a long time." Ava sat across from her with her coffee untouched. "I'm listening." "I was retained through a referral from an attorney connected to the Hawthorne family's legal team," Fossey said. "I didn't disclose that to you at the time. I should have. That relationship, even as a referral chain, even without a direct conflict of interest on paper, created a situation where my advice was not as independent as you deserved." She stopped. "When I counseled you to accept the settlement, I genuinely believed it was your best option. I also knew that fighting it would be an extremely difficult road, and I didn't push back on the terms as hard as I should have, and I have thought about that for 7 years." Ava looked at her without speaking. The silence in the kitchen had weight. "What do you have?" Ava said finally. Fossey opened the briefcase. She produced a folder, set it on the table, and slid it across. "During the negotiation, I was provided with documents by the Hawthorne legal team that were characterized as supporting their account of events. Standard discovery material. I retained copies per standard practice." She paused. "One of those documents is an internal communication between Martin Hawthorne and his lead attorney, dated 4 days after the accident. It references, obliquely, in the careful language of people who know they are creating a written record, the need to manage the official account of the evening." Ava opened the folder, read. Her expression didn't change visibly, but her hands on the paper tightened almost imperceptibly. "They gave you this?" she said. "They gave me the full discovery package. I don't believe they remembered this particular document was in it. It's 2 pages into a 40-page exhibit bundle." Fossey paused. "When Claire Ashworth's article ran Monday, I reread everything I had from that period. I hadn't looked at it in years." She met Ava's eyes. "I am prepared to provide this to the State Investigative Division and to testify to its provenance and the circumstances of its transmission." Ava set the document down. She looked at it for a long moment. "Why now?" she said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Fossey was quiet briefly. "Because when I read the article, I understood that the choice had become binary. Either I come forward or I watch what I allowed to happen, get used to take your home." She paused. "I'm 60 years old and I don't want to retire knowing I stayed quiet twice." Ethan wasn't there for that meeting. Ava had asked him not to be, which he'd understood. When she called him afterward, her voice was very controlled in a way that meant she was working to keep it that way. "She had a document," Ava said. "Internal correspondence. Ethan, it's not explicit. It's never explicit with people like them. But it's clear. Anyone who reads it clearly will understand what they were doing." "Does Pruitt's office know?" "I called him directly after she left. He wants the original by end of day." "And Fossey will cooperate?" "She already called her own attorney and is filing a formal disclosure statement this afternoon." A pause. "The walls are moving." He could hear it in her voice. Not triumph, nothing as simple as that. Something more complicated. The particular feeling of having carried a version of events that nobody believed for 7 years and finally having it confirmed in writing that you were right, that you hadn't imagined it, that the thing that happened to you was the thing that happened, and someone with standing had finally put their name next to it. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me again tomorrow." He thought about her for most of the rest of the day. Thought about what it would feel like to have a document in your hands that proved the shape of an injury you'd been told was your own fault. I didn't have a clean analogy for it in his own life. His losses had been different, the kind where nobody was lying about the cause. He just knew it would be a complicated feeling, not clean, not simple. The kind of truth that, when it arrives, doesn't make the wound disappear. It just finally gives it the right name. The county rezoning hearing was scheduled for December 18th. It had been on the calendar for 3 months, lost in the administrative machinery, unremarkable. The kind of hearing that most people in Bevel County didn't know was happening and wouldn't have cared about if they did. The kind of hearing that was designed, implicitly, to not attract attention. Claire Ashworth's second article changed that. It ran the following Monday, 8 days before the hearing. This one was longer, more detailed, built on the foundation of the first. It named the connection between Lieutenant Carver and Martin Hawthorne's political donations. It described the procedural irregularities in the Route 47 accident investigation in specific terms, citing sources familiar with the original responding deputy's account and the discrepancy between field notes and the official report. It didn't name Ava directly, a choice Ava had made deliberately, in conversation with Claire and her lawyers, because her story needed to emerge on her terms and in the right venue. But it made clear that the Harrison Street project was connected to a pattern of influence that extended back years and touched county infrastructure at multiple levels. The comments section of the Courier's website was not, as a general rule, a reliable indicator of public sentiment, but the 58 responses to Claire's second article, the vast majority of them from people who lived in Bevel County, the tone of the letters to the editor that the Courier began receiving. These were indicators of something shifting, not a groundswell, just the particular sound of a community that has been made aware of something it suspects it should have been aware of earlier and is deciding what to do with that awareness. People started calling Ethan. People he knew casually, customers, neighbors, parents from Sophie's school, who had read the articles and who said things like, "I always felt like something wasn't right about that property process, and my brother-in-law works at the county and says it's all true." He listened, didn't say much. He wasn't collecting allies in any organized sense. He understood the difference between public opinion and actual legal and procedural mechanisms, and he knew that sentiment didn't win hearings. But it changed the environment in which hearings happened, and that mattered. The Hawthorne's response to the second article was louder than it had been to the first. Martin Hawthorne issued a statement through his PR firm that characterized the Courier reporting as a politically coordinated attack on economic development, called for an investigation into the newspaper's sources, and announced that the Harrison Street project would proceed as planned and that the rezoning hearing would confirm the community's support for growth and progress. Davis Hawthorne was not mentioned in any public statement. He had, as far as Ethan could determine, been very quiet for several weeks, quieter than a 30-year-old man with his level of ordinary visibility in the community would naturally be. He'd been at a Hawthorne family attorney's office twice in the past 10 days, according to Roy, who had this information from a source he refused to identify, but who was apparently reliable. Ethan was thinking about Davis Hawthorne on a Thursday evening, 9 days before the hearing, when he heard the car on Harrison Street. He'd developed the habit, over the past several weeks, of being aware of the street outside Ava's house in ways he didn't fully acknowledge to himself. He lived 3 blocks away, close enough to be useful, far enough to respect her independence, which was something she had in abundance and clearly needed. He wasn't monitoring the street. He was just aware of it. The way a person who's spent years in environments where awareness keeps people alive develops a background attention that doesn't fully switch off. The car that slowed outside her house was a black SUV, which was unremarkable. What was less unremarkable was that it slowed specifically at the gap in the oak trees that gave a clear sightline to her front entrance, and then moved on. He was at his kitchen window and couldn't get the plate from that angle. He didn't see it come back. But he made a note of the time, 8:47 p.m., and he called Ava. "There was a vehicle outside," he said. "Black SUV. It slowed at your entrance." A brief pause. "Is it still there?" "No, I couldn't get the plate. I'm probably being overly cautious." "You're not," she said. "There was a car outside 2 nights ago. I didn't say anything because I thought I was imagining it." "You weren't imagining it." Another pause. "Ethan." Her voice was level, but he could hear the effort. "What does this mean?" "It means they're watching. It means they know the hearing is coming and they're unsettled." He thought carefully before speaking again. "I don't think they'll do anything physical. The stakes are too high now, with the investigation open. But I'm going to call Pruitt." "Okay." "And Ava, are you comfortable there tonight?" A pause that was slightly longer than the question required. "I'll lock up properly." "That's not what I asked." Silence. "I'm fine," she said. "That's also not—" "I know," she said, softer this time. "I know it's not what you asked." Another pause. I don't do well with the other answer, with saying I'm not fine. You don't have to do it well, he said. Just do it. He heard her exhale. I don't really want to be alone tonight, she said. Is that something I'm allowed to say? Yes, he said. Of course it is. He called Linda, who handled the overnight arrangement for Sophie with the cheerful flexibility of a woman who had long ago decided that being needed was one of life's better features. He walked the 3 blocks to Ava's house in the December cold, hands in his jacket pockets, and she answered the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching the street. He came in. She didn't say anything about it being strange or about what it meant or about the line between practical caution and something else. And he didn't say anything either, and they sat in her living room with the lamps on and talked about ordinary things. Sophie's latest Creek Rock acquisition, a show Ava had been watching, a customer at the garage who'd brought in a truck with a custom engine that had been assembled by someone who had clearly learned mechanics from a YouTube channel and an optimistic attitude. She laughed at the truck story, the real laugh he'd heard before, the one that came from somewhere undefended. He slept on her couch. She didn't argue about it. In the morning, over coffee, she was quiet in the way she went quiet, when something was organizing itself in her thoughts. He let it organize. I've been thinking about the hearing, she said finally. Okay. I want to speak, publicly, at the commissioner's meeting. She held her mug. Claire has offered to be there, Sheriff Pruitt will be there, my lawyers will be there, but I want to speak for myself. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. She met his eyes. I've been the person who signed a document in a hospital room and stayed quiet for 7 years. I'm finished being that person. He thought about what it would cost her to stand in a public room and say the things she'd spent 7 years not saying. He thought about the particular courage of someone who had every reason to protect themselves by staying private, choosing instead to be visible. What are you going to say? He asked. The truth, she said. Just the truth? He nodded. Then say it. The 18th of December was a gray morning, the sky the particular flat color of winter in Kentucky, the air cold and damp in a way that went through a coat rather than stopping at it. Ethan had been awake since 5. He drove Sophie to school, explaining only that he had an important meeting this morning, and Sophie, who was 8 and therefore knew when the adult information being shared with her was the edited version, gave him the long look and then kissed his cheek and got out of the car and went into school without making him explain. He loved her so much it was sometimes physically uncomfortable. The Bevel County Courthouse had a public meeting room off the main hall that held roughly 100 people in the plastic and metal chairs that government spaces favored universally. By 8:45, the hearing was scheduled for 9. There were already people in the corridor outside. Not an overflow crowd, not a mob, but more people than this particular meeting had any precedent for drawing. Ethan could see Claire Ashworth near the back with a notebook. He could see Tom Haskell in the 3rd row, which surprised him. He hadn't known Haskell was coming, and the old deputy looked like a man who had made a deliberate decision that morning about what he was going to do with his remaining years. He could see Patricia Geary, his lawyer, and beside her the 2 attorneys from Ava's civil team, who had the organized alertness of people who had prepared for this room. He could see the Hawthorne camp on the other side. Attorneys, a PR aide with a tablet, the project developer who'd been at the planning office meetings, and in the back corner, Martin Hawthorne himself, who was 71 and had the expression of a man who was managing his surroundings rather than participating in them. Davis Hawthorne was not there. He found Ava in the corridor outside with her own attorneys. She was in a dark blazer and the composed, particular stillness she brought to situations that mattered. She looked at him when he came through the door, and something in her shoulders shifted fractionally, the way a person shifts when they've been holding something alone and another person arrives. You ready? He said. No, she said. But I'm going anyway. He almost smiled. That's the same thing. Commissioners' meetings had a bureaucratic rhythm that was hard to disrupt. Call to order, minutes approval, public comments, agenda items, the whole tedious machinery of local governance moving at its own deliberate pace. The Harrison Street rezoning variance was 5th on the agenda, which meant 40 minutes of other business first. 40 minutes during which the room's unusual fullness was something every commissioner was visibly aware of and pretending not to be. When Chairman Gerald Oakes finally called the Harrison Street item, the room shifted. The Hawthorne development team presented first, the lawyer, practiced and smooth, with renderings of the commercial complex and projections showing job creation and tax revenue and the kind of economic language that was designed to make opposition seem like opposition to progress itself. The attorney cited the county's economic development priorities, the procedural correctness of the approval process, the project's benefit to the community. He spoke for 15 minutes and was confident throughout. Then the chair opened public comment. The first two speakers were local business owners, one of whom Ethan knew by name, a man who ran the hardware store, who had apparently been closing down for 15 years and was still there to say that the Harrison Street project had never been properly disclosed to adjacent business owners, and that the approval process had bypassed required public notice. The second speaker was a county resident who'd done her own research on the commissioner's financial disclosures and whose 3 minutes were a model of clipped, documented specificity. Then Ava wheeled to the microphone. The room went quieter in a way that was different from the procedural quiet of people waiting to speak. It was the quiet of attention, real attention, the kind that happens when something is about to be said that matters, and everyone in the room knows it before the first word. She didn't start with her own story. She started with the street. Harrison Street has 14 properties, she said. Her voice was even. Not performing evenness, actually even, which is harder. 11 of them have been purchased in the past 18 months by entities connected to Hawthorne Development Associates at prices that documentation in the public record shows were in several cases substantially below market value, and transactions completed without independent appraisals. She paused. I want commissioners to understand the picture on that street before they vote on a variance that will determine what that street becomes. She laid it out methodically. The procedural irregularities in the approval process, the relationship between two of the commissioners and the Hawthorne family's political donation history, the inspection that had appeared at her door within 2 weeks of receiving the purchase offer, the vandalism to her accessibility ramp. She spoke about each of these things not as grievances but as a sequence, a documented pattern, which was what they were. And then she said, 7 years ago, on Route 47, a member of this family caused an accident that permanently disabled me. The official investigation that followed was compromised. Evidence was managed. A witness was erased from the record. I was presented with a settlement agreement while I was still in a rehabilitation facility, and I signed it because I was 23 years old and out of options, and the people on the other side of the table had more resources and more patience than I had. She stopped for one moment, a single controlled beat. I am not 23 anymore. The room was completely still. I am not asking for your sympathy, she continued. I am asking for a vote that reflects the documented record, both in the approval process for this project and in the history of how this family has operated in this county. Those records exist. The Courier has reported on them. The State Investigative Division is reviewing them. I am asking you to look at them before you decide. She rolled back from the microphone. No dramatic pause. No look around the room to measure the effect. She just rolled back and the room remained very quiet, and then it wasn't quiet anymore. Ethan was standing against the wall at the back, and he didn't speak, and he didn't have to. He watched the commissioners, watched the particular discomfort that moves across the face of a person who has been planning to do something quietly and has just discovered that quiet is no longer an option. Commissioner Linda Voss was the first to speak after the chair called for order. She was 64, had been on the commission for 8 years, and had the look of someone doing real-time mathematics about her own legacy. I'd like to table this vote, she said, pending review of the documentation referenced in today's testimony and in recent press reporting. Oakes looked at her. Commissioner Voss, I'm making a motion, she said, clearly. I'd like a second. Commissioner Ray Tillman, who Ethan knew had no particular relationship with the Hawthorns and had shown visible discomfort throughout the developer's presentation, said, second. The Hawthorne attorney was on his feet immediately, citing procedural grounds, timeline commitments, economic urgency. He was precise and he was loud, and he spoke over 2 attempts by the chair to restore order. Ethan watched Martin Hawthorne from across the room. The old man was sitting with his hands on the table in front of him, very still, and his expression was one that Ethan had seen on the faces of men in very different circumstances. The expression of someone recalculating in real time, revising their understanding of what they thought they'd controlled. The vote to table was 4-3. It wasn't a defeat of the project. It wasn't a vindication of 7 years. It was a procedural pause, a breathing room, a signal that the room had changed. But the Hawthorne attorney, for all his composed professionalism, had not expected it, and that was visible in the way he gathered his documents and the careful absence of expression on his face as he did. Outside, in the corridor, Ethan found Ava surrounded by her attorneys and by people he didn't know. Constituents, apparently, people who had come to the meeting or heard about it and wanted to say something to her directly. She was handling it with the same directness she brought to everything, listening more than she spoke, thanking people without performing gratitude. She looked at him across the corridor. He looked back at her. There were people between them and no clean way through, and it didn't matter. He had stood at the back of a room and watched her take back something that had been taken from her by degrees and over years, and she had done it without asking for his permission or his help or his anything beyond his presence, which was the only thing he'd offered. And he understood watching her that this was what she'd needed all along. Not someone to fight for her, but someone who would stand still while she fought, who would be there without making it about being there. Claire Ashworth appeared at his elbow. "That was something," she said. "Yes," he said. "She's not done," Claire said. "The civil case, with the new evidence with Fossey and Haskell and Pruitt, she has a real case now. This hearing was one room." She paused. "There are going to be more rooms." "I know," he said. "How are you holding up? Your business, the violations?" "We're managing." He watched Ava across the corridor, still surrounded, still talking to people with that particular focused attention she gave to whoever was speaking. "She's okay," he said, which wasn't the question Claire had asked, but was apparently what he needed to say. Claire looked at him with the expression of a journalist who had been watching people for 20 years and had learned to read what they revealed by what they didn't quite conceal. "Yeah," she said, "I can see that." He stayed in the corridor until the crowd thinned. He didn't approach Ava directly. She had her attorneys, had things to discuss, had a world of next steps that had just become realer and more demanding. He was getting his coat from where he'd folded it over a chair when he felt her behind him. "Ethan." He turned. She was tired. He could see it now that the room had cleared and the attention had dropped away. Real exhaustion, the kind that follows the sustained effort of being composed in public when what you are underneath is a person who has been fighting for a very long time. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, something that had been absent in the months he'd known her and was present now. Not peace. Not that. There was too much still unsettled for peace, but something adjacent to it. The particular quality of a person who has stopped waiting. "Thank you," she said. "You did that," he said. "All of it. You made it possible. You would have gotten here eventually." She looked at him for a moment. "Maybe," she said, "but not today." She paused. "Today required you." He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there in the emptying corridor of the Bevel County Courthouse on a gray December morning, and he looked at this woman who had come back to her hometown to reclaim something and had ended up reclaiming more than a house. And he thought about 5 years of small routines and honest work, and a life that had contracted down to the size of what was manageable. He thought it might be time to let it expand again. "Buy you a coffee?" he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. Almost. "I thought you didn't like Della's coffee." "It's adequate," he said. She did smile then. The real one. Unguarded. The one he'd been cataloging without admitting it since the first morning she'd appeared in the doorway of his garage. "Yeah," she said. "Okay, coffee." They went out through the courthouse doors into the cold gray morning, and the town was there. The hardware store still open, the traffic lights still blinking, the particular unhurried life of a small place that had been forgotten by everyone who left, and was now, slowly, remembering itself. The coffee at Della's was, as advertised, adequate. They sat at the same table where Ethan had been sitting the morning everything started. The second window, the chair he always took. A second chair pulled up beside it with enough room for Ava's wheelchair to sit level with the table rather than awkward at the end of it, which was something he'd thought about before pulling the chair out. She noticed that he'd thought about it. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. Outside, Pine Hollow went about its gray December morning. A truck idled at the light. 2 women walked past with coats pulled against the cold. Della herself brought the coffees without being asked, set them down, looked at the two of them with the expression of a woman who has watched a town for 30 years and recognizes a moment when she sees one, and went back to her counter without commentary, which was, Ethan thought, the most tactful thing Della had ever done. "What happens now?" he asked. Ava wrapped her hands around the cup. "Now the lawyers work." She said it with the particular acceptance of someone who has learned to separate the things she can control from the machinery that has to operate on its own schedule. The civil case reopens with the new evidence: Fosse's disclosure, Haskell's statement, Pruitt's testimony. Patricia says it's a substantively different case than the one I had 7 years ago. Back then I had my account against the Hawthorne's resources. Now there's documentation. How long? Could be a year, could be 2. She looked at her coffee. These things don't move fast. Are you okay with that? She thought about it honestly. I'm better with it than I was a month ago. The waiting is different when you're not waiting alone. She glanced at him, then back at the cup. The state investigation is separate from my civil case. Pruitt's referral to the State Division is already in motion. Carver has been placed on administrative leave pending review, which happened quietly, without announcement, which is how those things happen. I found out through Patricia. And Davis Hawthorne? A pause. He retained separate counsel from his father 2 weeks ago. She said it evenly. Which tells its own story. It did. When a family that has operated as a unified front begins to divide its legal representation, it means someone has decided that the shared interest is no longer worth the shared exposure. Davis Hawthorne, at 30, was apparently less willing than his father to hold a line that was costing more than it was protecting. Ethan thought about Davis Hawthorne, not with particular feeling, just with the analytical clarity that came naturally to him when he considered problems. He was a man who had done a genuinely terrible thing at 22, had been protected from its consequences by people with the power and motivation to protect him, and had spent 8 years living inside that protection without being required to reckon with what it had cost someone else. That kind of life did particular things to a person. Not always the things you expected. Sometimes the protection itself became a weight. The knowledge of what you'd gotten away with sitting in the bottom of a man and affecting the specific gravity of everything he did afterward. Ethan didn't feel sorry for him, but he understood mechanically how a person got from one point to another through those particular circumstances. "What about the Harrison Street project?" he asked. "Dead, essentially. The developer issued a statement yesterday saying they were reassessing project viability. Very careful language." She almost smiled. "It means they've done the math and concluded that building a commercial complex at the center of an active corruption investigation is not the use of capital their investors had in mind." "And the remaining homeowners on the street?" "Most of them were in contact with Ava's civil attorneys before the hearing. 3 families want to review whether the prices they were offered and accepted were genuinely fair market value given the circumstances around the negotiation." She paused. "That's a separate process, but it's moving." The cafe had filled up around them in the way that cafes fill on cold mornings, gradually, without fanfare, until the ambient murmur of it became its own kind of warmth. Ethan drank his coffee and thought about how much had changed between the morning he'd sat here with his phone and a man had put his foot on the wheel of a woman's chair while 23 people looked away, and this morning. "I've been thinking," Ava said. He waited. "I've been thinking about what the past 4 months have looked like from the outside." She chose her words with visible care. "A man I barely knew decided to get involved in a situation that wasn't his, and that cost him professionally and personally, and that put him in the way of people who had no reason to treat him gently." She looked at him. "That's an unusual thing for a person to do." "Not that unusual," he said. "Ethan." She said his name in the tone of a person who would like him to take what she's saying seriously. "It's unusual." He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Roy's face the morning of the first false violation notice, the particular outrage of a man who believes in fair dealing and has just seen a clean example of the opposite. He thought about Patricia Geary firing back at every notice within 48 hours, the systematic pleasure she took in a documented counter-record. He thought about Tom Haskell, who'd driven to the county courthouse on a December morning and sat in the third row of a public meeting to witness something being set right in a small, real way. "I think," he said slowly, "that people do what they can do when they finally decide to. The unusual part isn't getting involved. The unusual part is the moment of deciding." He paused. That part I can't really explain. She was quiet for a moment. Sophie explained it to me, she said. He looked at her. What? Last week. When I came over for dinner, you were in the kitchen and Sophie was showing me her rocks, and she told me. Ava stopped, and something shifted in her expression, softer than her usual presentation, less managed. She said her dad used to be a little sad sometimes, but that he wasn't sad as much anymore. And then she showed me a rock she said was a fossil and told me about how things get preserved in stone. She paused. She's 8. She's terrifying, he said. She's extraordinary. Ava looked at him steadily. Like her father. The word landed between them and stayed there. He didn't deflect it, which was something he would have done 2 months ago. He just looked at her and let it be what it was. I'm not extraordinary, he said. I just showed up. Ethan. Again the tone. Showing up is the whole thing. It has always been the whole thing. He thought about that. About showing up. The physical and emotional act of it. The decision to be present in the specific situation in front of you, rather than the easier, safer situation you could construct by looking elsewhere. He'd learned in the military that the most important tactical decision was often not what you did when you were there, but whether you showed up at all, whether you put yourself in the position to act or positioned yourself to avoid acting. The rest was detail. He'd spent 5 years after Sarah died getting very good at avoiding positions that required him to act. It had felt like stability, had looked like stability. The garage open every morning, Sophie's lunch packed, the creek stones cataloged, the routines in place. But somewhere underneath the stability, something had been waiting, the way Haskell had been waiting out on Cutter Road splitting wood for someone to ask the right question. He supposed Ava Sterling, in a cafe on a Tuesday morning with 3 men laughing at her and a room full of people looking away, had been that question. The formal results came in stages, the way results in legal and institutional processes always do, not in clean moments of resolution, but in a sequence of papers filed and findings issued and statements released that collectively added up to something that could be called justice. If you were willing to accept that justice in practice looked considerably less cinematic than justice in principle. In February, 6 weeks after the hearing, the State Investigative Division completed its review of the Route 47 accident case and issued a finding that the original investigation had been compromised by procedural irregularities consistent with external interference. Lieutenant Carver was placed on permanent administrative leave and later resigned. The finding was careful and specific and did not use the word corruption. It used the phrase failure to maintain the integrity of investigative process. But the local and regional press translated it without difficulty, and Claire Ashworth's third article, which ran the same week, was the one that made the wire services and got picked up by papers in Lexington and Louisville. The morning that article ran, Ethan was at the garage doing a routine oil change when Roy came in with his phone, set it on the workbench face up with the article displayed, and said nothing. Just left it there and went back to his work. Ethan read it, wiped his hands on a rag, and went back to the oil change. They didn't discuss it. Some things don't need discussion to be fully understood between two people. The false code violations against Cross Auto were formally dismissed in March. Patricia Geary sent him a one-line email that said, "All clear, no further action pending. Well done," which was, for Patricia, effusive. The civil case, Ava's reopened claim against Davis Hawthorne and the parties responsible for the compromised investigation, settled out of court in April, 7 months after the December hearing. The terms were confidential, which was standard. What was not confidential, because Ava had negotiated it specifically as a non-negotiable condition, was a formal written acknowledgement of liability. A legal document stating that the accident on Route 47 had been caused by the negligent operation of a vehicle by Davis Hawthorne, that the blood alcohol evidence had been mishandled, and that the original settlement had been obtained under conditions that did not constitute fair negotiation. Ava called him the afternoon she signed it. "It's done," she said. He was behind the garage in the small yard where he kept the parts he was waiting on, and he sat down on an overturned crate in the April cold and held the phone. "How do you feel?" he asked. A long pause. He didn't try to fill it. "Like I can breathe differently," she said finally. "That sounds strange." "It doesn't. Like something I didn't know I was holding." She stopped. "I've been holding my breath for 7 years and I didn't know it was breath holding. I thought it was just how I breathed." Another pause. It's strange to feel your own lungs change. He stayed on the phone with her for a while, neither of them saying much that was essential, which was its own kind of language. When they hung up, he sat on the crate for another few minutes with the April sky above him and the sound of the street out front and thought about what Ava had said about breathing. About the invisible accommodations a person makes to survive something. How those accommodations become the architecture of a life, load-bearing in ways you don't notice until the pressure is removed and the structure shifts. He'd built his own invisible architecture after Sarah, the routines and the containment and the small radius of his days. He'd called it responsibility, and some of it was Sophie was real, and raising her alone was real work, and none of that had been avoidance exactly. But some of it had been. The decision to stop wanting things that could be lost, because he'd already learned what losing them felt like, and didn't trust himself to survive a second round. He was 37 years old, Sophie was 8. Sarah had been gone for 4 years, and the grief was real, and would always be real, and it had not, as it turned out, disqualified him from the rest of his life. He went back inside and told Roy to close up. Roy looked at him with the assessment of a man who has watched another man carefully for several years and has concluded that something in the other man is working correctly for the first time in a while. "Take the afternoon?" Roy said. "Yeah." "Good," Roy said, like it was the most obvious thing. He picked Sophie up from school early for the first time in her memory. She came out of the building with the expression of a child encountering an unexplained deviation from routine, careful, interested, not yet worried. "Did something happen?" she asked, buckling her seatbelt. "No, I just wanted to pick you up." She studied him from the back seat with the particular assessment of a person who has been the child of a complicated adult for long enough to know the difference between something happened and "I just wanted to." Apparently the distinction was clear because she settled back and started telling him about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend over whether horses could technically be pets, which led to a lengthy and impressively structured argument about the definition of the word pet that occupied the entire drive home. He listened to every word of it. Pine Hollow in April was a different place than Pine Hollow in October. The oaks on Harrison Street had come back into leaf, thick and green, the way they came back every year regardless of what happened beneath them. The creek behind Ethan's house was running high from the spring rains, and Sophie's collection of smooth stones had expanded to include 3 pieces of what she continued to insist was fossil material, and which Ethan had gently and unsuccessfully explained was probably just weathered limestone. He'd stopped correcting her about it. Some things were better believed. The neighborhood had changed in small ways. 3 of the Harrison Street properties that the Hawthorns had acquired were resold. 2 to their original owners at original prices. 1 to a family that had been on a waiting list for affordable housing in the county for 18 months. The process had been mediated by the county development office under newly appointed leadership, following the resignation of one commissioner and the announced retirement of another. Small bureaucratic steps, unglamorous, unreported, except in a brief item in the back of the local weekly. But real. The Hawthorne family's development company filed for dissolution in May. Martin Hawthorne was not charged with any crime. The investigative finding had implicated Carver as the operational actor, and the internal correspondence that Fosse had produced, while damning in the civil case, didn't rise to the criminal threshold. This was the part that Ethan had known would be incomplete, because things like this were always incomplete. Justice in real life came in the form of the things that changed and the things that didn't, and you had to make your peace with the ratio. Davis Hawthorne was 30 and had a liability acknowledgement with his name on it and no family money moving freely around him anymore. And what he did with the rest of his life would be his own work. Ethan didn't think about him much. He'd found, over the years, that the people who had done damage and been held to account had their own roads to travel, and those roads weren't his to walk or judge. His attention was better spent elsewhere. It was better spent specifically on the dinner table on a Friday evening in late May, where Sophie was explaining to Ava the fossil situation with the focused intensity of someone who has been told they are wrong by multiple authorities and has not accepted this. "It has texture," Sophie said. "Regular rocks don't have texture like this." "Some rocks do," Ava said, with the directness she brought to everything, which Sophie received from her without offense in the way she somehow received it from nobody else. "But you could take it to the University Extension in Bardstown. They have a geology program, and they'll tell you definitively." Sophie considered this. What if they say it's just limestone? Then you'll know. And you can keep it anyway. Why would I keep it if it's just limestone? Because you found it, Ava said. That makes it yours regardless. Sophie thought about that. Then she put the rock carefully back in her pocket and picked up her fork and went back to dinner with the air of a case being tabled rather than closed. Ethan watched this exchange from across the table and felt something he'd been feeling in increasing amounts for the past several months without having a completely clean vocabulary for it. It wasn't happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something with this many layers. It was more like coherence, the feeling of parts of a life that had been moving separately beginning to occupy the same space. He'd been thinking about what to do with that feeling for weeks. Not rushing it, because things worth having weren't improved by hurrying, but thinking about it seriously. The way he thought about serious things, methodically, with honest accounting for what he wanted and what was realistic and what the risks were. After dinner, Sophie went to the creek. Supervised, it was still light. She was 8 and knew every inch of the bank. And Ethan and Ava sat on the porch with their coffee. The evening was warm. The oaks were in full leaf. Somewhere down the street a neighbor was mowing, the sound lazy and familiar. I've been thinking about staying, Ava said. He looked at her. You're going somewhere? No, that's what I mean. She held her mug. My company has been operating remotely with me here since October. I kept thinking of it as temporary, that eventually things would settle, and I'd go back to having an office in Louisville and being physically there most of the week. She paused. But the company is running fine, and I like being here. A beat. I like being here more than I expected to. He thought about asking what had changed her calculation. He thought he probably knew, and asking would be making her say something that she was already saying indirectly, which was not a generosity. It's a good place to be, he said instead. She looked at him sideways. That's what you're going with? I have more, but I'm pacing myself. She almost laughed. The almost laugh that was better than most people's real ones. She looked out at the street, at the evening coming down through the oaks, and there was something in her face that was new. Not new. He'd seen versions of it since December, but consolidated, settled in its own bones. I spent a long time, she said slowly, believing that what happened to me was the permanent definition of my life, that the accident was the central fact and everything else was arranged around it. She paused. I didn't think of it that way consciously, but looking back, the way I worked, the way I kept people at a distance, the way I handled everything alone, that's what I was doing. Building a life around the wound instead of around the person. He listened without moving. I don't think that anymore, she said, or I'm working on not thinking that anymore. It's not a switch. She glanced at him. But I wanted to tell you, because you're part of why. He was quiet for a moment. Below them in the yard, the light had gone golden and late, and he could hear Sophie at the creek, her voice, the particular sound of her moving through water in her boots, despite having been explicitly told about her boots. And the evening felt like something he'd been walking toward for a long time, from a direction he hadn't been watching. Can I tell you something? He said. Yes? When Sarah died, I decided, not consciously, but I decided, that I'd used up my share of certain things. He looked at his hands. That I'd had my people, and the right thing now was to protect what was left of them, which was Sophie, and do the work, and not ask for anything that could be taken. He paused. I thought that was wisdom. I think now it was mostly fear with a reasonable explanation attached to it. Ava was watching him with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. You changed that, he said. Not by... I don't mean you fixed anything. I mean watching you fight for what was yours reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for, including the things you haven't lost yet. He stopped. I'm saying this badly. No, she said quietly. You're not. He looked at her. She looked back at him in the way she'd been looking at him for months. That direct, undeflected attention that he'd been cataloging without letting himself name what it was. I'd like to take you to dinner, he said. Not Della's. Somewhere that requires a reservation. A pause. That took you long enough, she said. He felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in 4 years. I'm a methodical person. I noticed. But she was smiling now. The real one, the unguarded one. the one he'd been cataloging since the first morning in his garage. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." From the creek came the specific sound of Sophie discovering that the depth of water in her boots was no longer theoretical, followed by a noise that was equal parts outrage and delight, followed by the noise of her deciding that since she was already wet, she might as well continue what she was doing. Ethan stood up from the porch chair. "I have to go get my kid." "I know." Ava was still smiling. "Go get your kid." He went down the porch steps and across the yard and found Sophie standing in the creek with her boots full of water and her hands cupped around something she was examining with the intensity she brought to potential geological significance. "Boots," he said. "Look at this one," she said, holding it up. The rock was smooth and pale with a faint linear marking along one side. He looked at it. In the evening light, the marking it was probably nothing, almost certainly weathered limestone. But the linear quality of it was genuinely interesting, and he found himself crouching at the bank to see it better. "That's not nothing," he said. Sophie's face did the thing it did. "I know." "It's probably still limestone," he said. "But maybe not." "But maybe not," he agreed. He carried her back to the bank on his back because the boots were unsalvageable anyway, and she held the rock carefully in both hands the whole way. And behind them the creek went on in the evening light, indifferent and constant and clean. Book. There is a thing that people say about small towns, that nothing changes, that they're caught in amber, that the same families and the same problems and the same quiet arrangements of power reproduce themselves across generations without interruption. And there's enough truth in that to keep it circulating. But the other thing about small towns, the thing that gets said less, is that when things do change in them, the change is visible in a way it isn't in larger places. You can see the difference in a street, in a face you pass every morning, in the fact that a particular car no longer parks in front of a particular building. The change is human-scaled and therefore real in a way that statistics and trend lines can't quite replicate. Harrison Street in Pine Hollow, Kentucky, looked different by the summer. Not dramatically. It was still the same street, the same oaks, the same modest houses that had been there long enough to have grown into something permanent. But the 3 properties that had been returned were occupied again. There were lights in windows that had been dark. There was a garden where there hadn't been one. Ava's house on the corner was the same as it had always been, adapted and well-kept and full of books, and the particular evidence of a life being lived purposefully in it. She'd gotten the downstairs extension properly permitted and finished. A project she'd been planning for 2 years and had finally moved on, with a contractor Roy had recommended. A man who did careful work and didn't require managing. The vintage Mustang was still in the garage. She'd started working on it in March, on weekends, with Ethan's help and Roy's occasional consultation on the engine components. It wasn't finished. It might not be finished for years. But the carburetor they'd been working on the day she'd told him about her father, the one they'd never got to, was back on the workbench, and the work was moving. Some things, it turned out, could be returned to. Some things that had been set down in grief or fear or exhaustion could be picked back up. Not the same as they were before. Nothing comes back the same, but real and present and worth continuing. Ethan had learned that. He was still learning it. He suspected he would be learning it for a long time, which was fine, because he was 37 years old and had a daughter who believed in fossils, and a garage with a hand-painted sign, and a woman 3 blocks away who looked at him without flinching, and the learning felt like the right use of the time he had. Roy, for his part, had stopped making faces about any of it, which either meant he'd made peace with the situation or had simply transferred his energy to other observations. Ethan suspected the latter. Roy's capacity for observation was not finite. Sophie put the possibly not limestone rock on her windowsill between 2 smoother creek stones and left it there through the rest of spring and into summer. She never did take it to the university extension in Bardstown. Ethan thought about suggesting it a few more times and then didn't, because there was something in the uncertainty that seemed to be the point. The keeping of a thing whose full nature hadn't been resolved, the willingness to live alongside a question rather than forcing it to an answer. He understood that now better than he would have a year ago. The last evening of June was warm and running long, the light staying past 8, the kind of evening that made the Kentucky summer feel like a compensation for the winters. Sophie was asleep by 9, exhausted by a day at the creek that had involved 3 potential fossils, 2 definitely not fossils, and one minnow that she had caught in her hands and released with the gravity of a person conducting a sacred act. Ethan sat on his back porch in the long light with a glass of water and thought about the past 9 months with the same methodical attention he brought to most things. He thought about a cafe and a wheel and a room full of people looking away. He thought about Roy's face and Tom Haskell's kitchen and Gerald Pruitt's untouched coffee in a diner in Tennessee. He thought about a paper document replaced by a typed one and what that small substitution had cost a 23-year-old woman in a rehabilitation facility, and what it had cost her for 7 years afterward, and what it had finally cost the people who did it when the weight of it was no longer something they could manage. He thought about what Roy had said the very first day. People said things and then stopped saying them. The thing about silence, enforced silence, the silence that money and power buy, is that it has a lifespan. It feels permanent because it's designed to feel permanent. But silence is just the absence of sound, and absence can be ended by anyone willing to make the right noise at the right moment. Tom Haskell had been willing, finally, after years of splitting wood on Cutter Road. Gerald Pruitt had been willing, after years of waiting for someone to call. Margaret Foss had been willing when the cost of staying silent finally exceeded the cost of speaking. And Ava had been willing from the beginning. That was the thing that people sometimes missed in her story, the thing that got lost in the narrative of what was done to her. She had never stopped being willing. She had signed a document at 23 because she was exhausted and alone and the math didn't work. But she had never once decided that what happened to her was acceptable. She'd just been waiting, in her competent and contained way, for the conditions to change. Ethan had not saved her. He wanted to be clear about that in his own understanding, because the alternative version, the one where a man rides in and rescues a woman and the story is really his story, was not what had happened and not a story he was interested in telling himself. What had happened was simpler and more complicated at the same time. He had shown up, and she had already been ready, and showing up and being ready at the same moment turned out to be enough to change the math. That was all courage usually was. Not absence of fear, not extraordinary capacity, not some quality distributed unfairly at birth. Just the willingness to be in the room when it mattered, to not walk past the thing that was happening, to do the small next thing that was yours to do and trust that the other people who were also willing would do theirs. He heard her coming up the porch steps before he saw her, the specific sound of her chair on the wood, and he looked over and she was there, having let herself in through the side gate the way she did now, with 2 cups of coffee that were going to be too late in the evening for either of them, but which neither of them would refuse. "Sophie asleep?" she said. 40 minutes ago. He made a room on the small table beside him. "You didn't have to bring coffee." "I know." She set both cups down and settled beside him in the long light. "I wanted to." They sat quietly for a while, the way people sit quietly when they're comfortable enough with each other that silence isn't something to fill. The summer evening moved around them. A bird somewhere, the creek at the back of the yard, the distant, easy sound of the neighborhood existing in its small, ordinary life. "My mother called today," Ava said. "How is she?" "She wants to come back and see the house, see what I've done with it." She held her cup. "She hasn't been back since she left. I think she was afraid it would be different in a way she wasn't ready for." A pause. "I told her it is different, but that different isn't the same as wrong." "What did she say?" "She said she'd come in August." He nodded. He thought about a mother who had moved away from the house where her daughter grew up because the stairs had become too much, and a daughter who had come back to it to reclaim something, and all the distance between those two versions of the same place, and how it might feel to close that distance in August, in the summer light. "Good," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The light was going golden now at the edges the way June light did, and the yard was the comfortable mess of a place where a child had been playing all day and nobody had cleaned it up yet. And across the back fence, the oaks on Harrison Street were full and green and unreasonably large for the amount of time they'd been standing there. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what I would have said if you'd asked me last October how the next year was going to go." "What would you have said?" "I don't know. Something practical. Something about the legal strategy and the hearing and the timeline." She paused. "I wouldn't have said any of this." She gestured. At the porch, at the yard, at the evening, at the approximate geography of what they'd become to each other. "I wouldn't have known to say it." "Neither would I," he said. Does that scare you? He thought about it. About all the things he hadn't known to want that had turned out to be the things that mattered. About a pair of boots full of creek water and a possibly limestone rock on a windowsill and a Mustang carburetor on a workbench and a woman on his back porch in the June light asking him if he was scared. No, he said, not anymore. She reached over and put her hand over his on the armrest of his chair. The same gesture from months ago, the same brief contact, except that this time neither of them moved away from it. The evening held still around them. The creek ran at the bottom of the yard. Sophie's smooth rocks stood their watch on the windowsill upstairs, including the one whose nature was still undecided, preserved, and kept, and believed in regardless. It wasn't a perfect life. It wouldn't be. There were still cases moving through systems, still papers being filed, still the ordinary complexity of two people with full and real histories finding the shape of something new. There was still grief and its particular residue. There was still a little girl who needed her father to be present in ways that were sometimes easy and sometimes hard. There were still mornings that started wrong, and mechanics that didn't go as planned, and coffee that was adequate at best. But there was also this: a porch in the long evening of a summer that had come after a very long winter, and two people who had learned, the hard way, the only way, that the life still worth living was the one right in front of you, if you were willing to look at it without flinching. Sometimes that's the whole story. Sometimes that's enough.